This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Telly Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. South Korean President Yoon vows to go down fighting, even as the walls begin to close around him over his shock decision to declare martial law last week. Donald Trump reportedly invites Chinese President Xi Jinping to his inauguration in Washington next month. If he attends, it will be an unprecedented move by the leader of a top U.S. rival. Now, Australia leverages sport as diplomacy, spending millions on Papua New Guinea's rugby league, but with a catch. The deal requires the Pacific nation to shun security ties with China. And U.S. senators sounding the alarm over cybersecurity in the aftermath of a massive breach of American telcos by a hacking group allegedly linked to China. Still ahead on East Asia tonight, as South Korea grapples with political uncertainty, we look back 45 years to the start of a violent military dictatorship in the country, one that also saw the imposition of martial law. The South Korean President Yoon has vowed to fight until the end as he defends his decision to impose martial law last week. Well, he has no intention of resigning, even as opposition lawmakers propose a second impeachment bill against him. Well, that vote is expected to take place this Saturday.
지금껏 국정 마비와 국헌 문란을 주도한 세력과 범죄자 집단이 국정을 장악하고 대한민국의 미래를 위협하는 일만큼은 어떤 일이 있어도 막아야 합니다. 저는 끝까지 싸울 것입니다.
Amid Mr. Yoon's refusal to step down, more members of the ruling People Power Party say they will vote to impeach the president on Saturday. Local media say at least 7 have said they will do so, including party leader Han Dong-hoon. South Korean residents, meantime, have been mostly supportive of efforts to impeach Mr. Yoon.
탄핵이 돼야 된다고 생각하는 거는 변함이 없는 것 같아요. 지금이 와가지고. 처음에는 좀 의아했는데 지금은 마땅히 해야 된다.
The walls continue to close in on President Yoon, with the National Assembly passing a new bill allowing an independent counsel to investigate him on rebellion charges. However, the bill will require the president's approval. Earlier this week, Parliament passed a similar motion that did not need Mr. Yoon's approval, calling for a permanent special counsel to investigate him. CNA's senior Korea correspondent Lee Myun-suk tells us what to expect in the second impeachment vote this weekend.
Now, President Yoon said that he will fight to the end as he defended his martial law declaration on Thursday morning. In a lengthy national address, he accused the opposition, calling them anti-state forces, of paralyzing the South Korean government and undermining the rule of laws. Now, he repeated this several times, how making that emergency martial law declaration was necessary to protect the free democracy here in South Korea. But he says he wasn't to paralyze the National Assembly or hurt anyone.
결국 병력이 투입된 시간은 한두 시간 정도에 불과합니다. 만일 국회 기능을 마비시키려 했다면 평일이 아닌 주말을 기해서 계엄을 발동했을 것입니다. 국회 건물에 대한 단전 단수 조치부터 취했을 것이고 방송 송출도 제한했을 것입니다. 그러나 그 어느 것도 하지 않았습니다.
But after that speech was made, the ruling party head Han Dong-hoon said President Yoon's address was a key to confessing to insurrection and proposed that the ruling party members vote to impeach President Yoon. Now the National Assembly is expected to take a vote on the impeachment bill for the second time around this Saturday at 5 p.m. local time. And it is possible that this time you will have the 2/3, the 200 members needed in the 300-member parliament to pass the impeachment bill. Since several ruling party members, now including the party leader Han Dong-un has said that they would vote to impeach him. The opposition only needed 8 more votes to pass that bill last week when the first bill was put to vote, but it is possible that they will need 9 votes now because Cho Guk, a key member from a smaller opposition party and also the former justice minister, has lost his parliamentary seat after the Supreme Court on Thursday upheld the 2-year sentence handed to him by the 2 lower courts.
For more insights, let's speak with John Delury, visiting professor, Department of Political Science from Lewis University in Rome. Well, a warm welcome to East Asia Tonight, Professor. First up, let's talk about President Yoon, who has vowed to fight to the very end, yet his position seems increasingly untenable. I mean, are you surprised by his persistence, and what exactly you think is motivating him to hold on to power?
Well, I'm not surprised by the speech. A president who would do such a thing in a robust liberal democracy, declare martial law sort of overnight with that level of stubbornness and sort of self-confidence, we could say. It's not probably surprising that the same actor will, defend himself and insist he's going to fight to the very end. I mean, the end could come very soon. It's, as you heard from the report, looking increasingly likely that the National Assembly will vote to impeach on Saturday, which would basically be the end of his presidency for the time being. But until then, he is the president. It is a constitutional democracy. He occupies that post. And with the speech, he came out in a very combative mode. That's why there's a lot of concerns in South Korea of what else he could do in desperation until and unless the point at which he is removed from office.
I mean, and to add to that point, we've got more members of Yoon's own ruling party saying that, they're going to join the opposition to impeach him. What do you think is behind this change of heart? And it reveals, right, about the fractures within the party?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a change of heart yet. There's a constantly shifting recalculation on the part of Conservative Party members in terms of, these are political actors. So they are calculating their political interest, what the conservative constituency that's left or that they think they can cobble together for what would be an upcoming presidential election in a matter of maybe months. Where they can get votes to maybe hang on to the presidency and avoid complete implosion of their party, which is not impossible. It is not a sort of well consolidated party in terms of leadership structure. Even President Yoon himself came in as a sort of outsider, you could say, almost kind of from out of nowhere. That was part of why he won the last election, is because the Korean public saw him as not an insider, and the Conservative Party is quite generally unpopular. But there's not really a structure behind him. That's why we're seeing this level of chaos. Even the party leader, Han Dong-hun, is not, for example, a sitting member of the legislature. So even before this, he is sort of called on the party before the first round of vote last weekend. He had a so-called change of heart and said we should vote for impeachment, but then that was reversed within 24 hours. And again, he's not even there in the building to vote himself. So there's a lot of chaos on the conservative side as they are fracturing and trying to calculate a way to move forward politically.
So, Professor, I mean, to be honest, I've been stalking you on social media, and you have been writing rather extensively about, what's unfolding in South Korea on X. And I just want to pick up an interesting point you made. And you've said that martial law can be a loophole in liberal democracies, potentially creating a dictatorship overnight. Now, tell us how relevant is this concept to South Korea's current political landscape?
Yeah, well, it's not every democracy that has it, but South Korea does have a martial law. And in some ways, that law will probably help them get out of this fiasco in that there are procedural requirements, for what the president is supposed to do when he declares martial law. He's supposed to hold a deliberation of his cabinet, of the state council. And so you're seeing reporting on how there was a 5-minute meeting, no notes were taken. It certainly doesn't appear to constitute a deliberation. So that would be evidence against him that he violated the law for martial law. Similarly, there's a requirement for war or a warlike level of national emergency, which again, it's unlikely that his claims will be accepted as reaching that minimum. But still, this is all a law that does provide the president with a kind of constitutional power to suspend constitutional, certainly civilian rule and impose martial law. He exploited that loophole. And I would expect that going forward, not in this first stage, but in the real cleanup and the aftermath that Korean democracy will have to do, they'll be taking a very hard look at that loophole and how the ability to martial law, should that exist in the Constitution, how can it be constrained in the future?
Also, we've been reporting how the police, are conducting all these raids on offices associated with President Yoon. Professor, what kind of evidence or paper trail do you think they're most likely targeting?
Well, any kind of written communications between, so far the circle between those who were actively involved with the president in any kind of planning, however long that goes back in terms of conversations, requests. There have been some leaked documents. I think we're still trying to find out, certifying everything. But how far back does some level of planning go to do this? And how many individuals were involved? This so far is getting into primarily the military, the defense ministry, and also the intelligence and security services. So this is incredibly messy. You have also got multiple agencies doing the investigation with sometimes overlapping jurisdictions. So it's very hard, even for really well-meaning, honest actors on the ground in Korea, to figure out how to do this. But they'll be doing the best job that they can to get evidence before anything is destroyed, to establish who was involved, how far did it go back, and that will be evidence in a very possibly a case against the president and however many people for insurrection. So there's quite a bit at stake.
So, also as somebody with deep expertise on North Korea, I'm curious to know what your thoughts on how North Korea media have been framing the protest and all the political instability in the South. I mean, how are they capitalizing on this narrative?
Well, no surprises so far, and that's a little comforting. So far, they're doing what they did the last time this happened in the winter of 2016 and into the spring of 2017. Of course, there was a scandal on the part of the president then, Park Geun-hye. There were millions of people in the streets. The National Assembly voted to impeach her, and then was reviewed by the court. So during that time, we have kind of a baseline to look at North Korea and their response. And like this time so far, they waited a little bit. They didn't report it the next day in their news. But again, we're seeing yesterday, it was the first report from North Korea domestically, so to their domestic audience, with pictures of mass demonstrations in Seoul, talking about the sort of insane actions of the President Yoon. And so, of course, it depends on how the story unfolds in South Korea. But I would anticipate, I would kind of hope for this staying at the level of North Korea using it for propaganda value to essentially show to their people, look how chaotic things are in South Korea. Now, interestingly, that means that the North Korean state is letting its people see the freedoms that South Korean citizens are able to exercise to protest against their own government. But apparently the North Korean state's calculation is it's not going to risk triggering some kind of corresponding action on the part of North Koreans, but instead it will fit the North Korean narrative of misrule in the South and of sort of democratic chaos, essentially. So let's see. It could turn in different directions, but so far that seems to be their approach.
Well, it's been great chatting with you. Thanks so very much for your time and thoughts. John Delury, visiting professor, Department of Political Science at Lewis University. Well, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, China expanding a private pension scheme to help its rapidly aging population. And while the U.S. takes aim at Beijing with more tariff hikes on its clean tech industry. Hello again. Good to have you back on East Asia tonight. Well, it's time now for your business updates, and Roland Lim is standing by with the very latest. So, China expanding its private pension scheme to the entire country, I believe.
You heard right. The government will roll out the program this Sunday, extending it from 36 pilot cities. The change comes after Beijing announced it would delay the retirement age starting next year, triggering a backlash. The pension program will allow workers to contribute as much as $1,650 a year to tax-sheltered accounts and expands the category for eligible pension products to include government bonds and index funds. Now, private pensions are known as the third pillar of China's retirement system, meant to supplement the public safety net and corporate annuities. But analysts say both corporate and private schemes are underdeveloped, while the public scheme is already under significant public financial pressure. China also facing external duress as the EU reaches a provisional deal to sanction Chinese entities for the first time for their role in supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. 6 China and Hong Kong-based companies will have their assets frozen, while 1 Chinese citizen will face a visa ban. Meanwhile, China's top leadership is meeting at the annual Central Economic Work Conference. That's a key gathering to set the tone and chart policy for the world's second biggest economy in the coming year. China's markets are awaiting signals from the ongoing Central Economic Work Conference. Mainland indices recovering ground from yesterday's losses, while Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index ending the day stronger. The Chinese currency against the greenback changing hands around the 720 level as investors digest the Beijing report that may allow a weaker currency to weather the risk of higher tariffs. Besides more stimulus measures, China has also rolled out a $1.4 trillion debt package to ease local government financing strains, with the hope of indirectly spurring economic growth. Now, while investors have questioned its adequacy, Beijing considers the plan a critical step towards reviving Asia's largest economy. CNA's Henry Yin explains.
China's ambitious debt swap plan has been set in motion, with the spotlight firmly on untangling the billions of dollars in local government debt that has weighed heavily on growth. Under the plan, local governments are allowed to issue about $836 billion in new bonds over 3 years and to reallocate $554 billion from previously announced bonds over the next 5 years. Beijing estimated the swap could save around $83 billion in interest payments over 5 years. In addition, another $276 billion in hidden debt related to the redevelopment of rundown homes will not come due until 2029. These measures are expected to relieve local governments' debt pressures. But why focus on local government debt now when so many other sectors could use a boost? Simply put, China is confronting a hidden local government debt crisis, one that's dragging down growth more than ever before. Local governments have long been the backbone of regional investment in China, channeling funds into infrastructure, property, technology, and even financial assets. Many of these investments have relied on what's called local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. These entities have quietly accumulated a staggering 60.4 trillion yuan, or about $8.4 trillion of debt as of 2023, according to the International Monetary Fund. China's property market turmoil has amplified the economic harm that such a mountain of debt can cause. With land sale revenues, the lifeblood of many local governments drying up, LGFVs are teetering on the brink of default. And as debt burdens rise, local authorities have been forced to tighten their belts, cutting civil servant salaries, trimming pensions, scaling back public services, and even imposing heavier fines and fees on businesses. These austerity moves have dented both business and consumer confidence, while leaving local creditors and infrastructure contractors in the lurch. The financial strain has also stymied money flows to the real economy, and that's created deflationary pressure. So what steps are being taken by Beijing to address this? The latest debt swap plan will raise the local government debt ceiling every year from 2024 to 2026. This is not China's first attempt at directly curbing local debt, though. Back in 2015, Beijing rolled out a debt for bonds program, encouraging local governments to exchange loans for lower interest bonds. A series of additional measures soon followed, including specific bonds designed to refinance existing projects. And as we look ahead, more strategies could be on the way. China's top policymakers are gathering at the annual Central Economic Work Conference, where they discuss growth targets and policies for the upcoming year. For now, all eyes are on how these new measures will reshape China's debt landscape and ultimately its economic trajectory. For CNA Explains, I'm Henry Yen.
Our trade tensions between China and the US are flaring. The Biden administration is rolling out higher tariffs on Chinese clean tech imports as the US seeks to safeguard its growing green energy sector. Washington says the hikes are expected to blunt China's policies and practices. Levies on key components used to make solar panels are set to double to 50%. Fresh tariffs will also be introduced on certain tungsten products, which are found in a wide range of goods, including computer chips and weapons. The move comes just after President Joe Biden warned of the potential risks posed by Donald Trump's plans to impose sweeping tariffs on imports from China and other countries. Beijing has weighed in, saying it is open to communicating with the economic and trade team of the Trump administration. Over in Japan, the Nikkei 225 ending the day at a two-month high, propped up by gains in chip-related shares following a stunning rally from big tech stocks on Wall Street overnight. Shares in the U.S. surged after inflation data for November reinforced expectations of an interest rate cut by the U.S. Federal Reserve, and that helped to boost shares of Advantest and SoftBank. The Nikkei also briefly touched the psychological 40,000 level before paring back gains on profit-taking from investors. Analysts say the current market environment is positive for Japanese equities as the yen is relatively weak against the dollar despite expectations that the Fed will be cutting rates, while the Bank of Japan is eyeing rate hikes. Markets have been scaling back the likelihood that the BOJ will hike rates when it meets next week, as policymakers appear in no rush to do so, given the uncertainties surrounding U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's return to the White House. The Japanese currency largely unchanged against the dollar, 152.50, changing hands with $1 US. Now, South Korea has unveiled corrective measures to safeguard competition in its aviation industry. This after Korean Air completed its takeover of rival Asiana Airlines, acquiring a roughly 64% stake in now a new subsidiary. The country's Fair Trade Commission announced several conditions, including a requirement that the enlarged airline group maintains at least 90% of seating capacity offered before the merger. The stipulation applies to 40 routes according to their 2019 levels. Though the airlines are also to submit an integration plan for their mileage programs within the next 6 months. The merger of South Korea's two biggest airlines come after Asiana Airlines' financial troubles worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic. The complete consolidation is expected to take 2 years and will reportedly not include any layoffs. Union workers from both airlines had been opposed to the merger. The combined entity is expected to create one of Asia's biggest carriers, estimated to rank around 10th place globally in terms of fleet size and international flights. And that is the latest in business. Oteli.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we're going to go for another break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, U.S. senators call for a cybersecurity boost in the wake of a breach of America's telecoms networks by actors allegedly linked to China. And Syria's interim leader urges those who have fled to return and help rebuild the war-torn nation. You're watching East Asia Tonight. South Korean President Yoon vows to fight until the end, doubling down on his decision to impose martial law last week, even as opposition lawmakers propose a second impeachment bill against him. Australia leverages sport as diplomacy, spending millions on Papua New Guinea's rugby league, but with a catch. The deal requires shunning security ties with China. And Donald Trump reportedly invites Chinese President Xi Jinping to his inauguration in Washington next month. If he attends, it will be an unprecedented move by the leader of a top U.S. rival. And the ceremony will take place on the 20th of January. The Chinese embassy in Washington has not confirmed this. According to U.S. media, the invitation was sent early November, shortly after the election on the 5th of that month. But it is not clear whether he has accepted it. While it's common for foreign dignitaries and diplomats to attend the U.S. presidential inauguration ceremonies, heads of state are not usually involved. In an interview with NBC News on Friday, the president-elect said that he got along very well with Mr. Xi and that the pair had just recently communicated. Mr. Trump has appointed numerous China hawks to key posts in his cabinet and has also threatened to impose tariff hikes of 60% or more on Chinese imports. Meantime, Mr. Xi also set the tone for Beijing's approach towards a second Trump term. Addressing the chiefs of several international economic institutions earlier this week, he said that China will continue focusing on its own affairs and resolutely safeguard its sovereignty and interests. One topic that is of contention between the U.S. and China is cybersecurity. Senators in the U.S. are calling for more action to address hacking threats. This follows allegations that China tried to infiltrate at least 8 American telcos and infrastructure firms to steal call data in an operation known as Salt Typhoon. Chinese officials have denied the claim, with the Chinese embassy in Washington previously saying that it firmly opposes and combats all kinds of cyber attacks. The U.S. House of Representatives is set to vote on an annual defense bill next week, which sets aside more than $3 billion for U.S. telecommunication companies to remove Chinese equipment from their networks. Officials say the attacks, known as Salt Typhoon, began as far back as 2022, and the purpose allegedly was to give Chinese operatives access to telecom networks across the U.S. The FBI says Salt Typhoon allowed hackers to obtain individual call records as well as the contents of phone calls and text messages. 2 senior Taiwan government officials are in the U.S. to meet with people associated with President-elect Donald Trump's transition team. That's according to Reuters, citing sources with knowledge of the matter. Lin Feifan and Xu Sijian, along with several staff from the island's National Security Council, are reportedly in Washington, D.C. for the meetings through this week. There is no official confirmation of what's on the agenda and who will be speaking to them from the U.S. side. Taiwan says such exchanges are a routine part of these officials' duties and that it had no further comment on the issue. The report said that individuals joining the meetings are likely those that may take up mid-tier political positions and that such meetings are not rare. It added that the meetings will not involve nominees for top jobs in the next Trump administration, given the sensitivity in Beijing over interaction between U.S. and Taiwan officials. Well, the visit comes amid heightened tensions between China and Taiwan. There has been a ramp-up in Chinese military activities around the island, following Taiwanese President William Lai's Pacific tour, which included 2 U.S. stopovers. Taipei said that Beijing's recent move is its way of setting a so-called red line for the incoming Trump administration. Australia and Papua New Guinea have signed a rugby deal worth more than $380 million over 10 years. Observers say the move is designed to ward off China. The agreement reportedly comes with a clause that Australia remain the Pacific Island nation's security partner for the next decade. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says the money will be used to support PNG's foray into Australia's National Rugby League competition, known as the NRL.
What this is about isn't just the elite level. This is about the grassroots level. It's about economic development. It's about our relationship between our peoples. And it provides, as sport often does, an opportunity for people to succeed not just in sport but in life. And that is why this partnership that we're announcing today isn't just about Papua New Guinea, it's also about our relationship with the Pacific.
In a world that is currently conflicted all over, I see as a leader of my country with concern the contests and conflicts happening in Eastern Europe, so to speak, or in Middle East, so to speak, and the potential of conflicts into the future. We want to preserve our Pacific safe, peaceful, and good for all of us to live in, especially our children. And wise, good generations construct a future in which their children could enjoy peace and comfort and life.
Australia and its allies have been seeking to strengthen ties with Pacific nations amid growing Chinese influence in the region. Beijing had been courting Pacific Island nations in recent times, drawing concern from Western nations. It previously signed a security and policing agreement with the Solomon Islands, and a similar proposal was reportedly extended to PNG. But the nation signed a bilateral security agreement with Australia last year. That agreement comes into force today, along with the rugby deal, though officials have not explicitly linked the two. And Roger Maynard in Sydney tells us how the deal is a win-win for Papua New Guinea and Australia, but comes at a cost to China's influence in the region.
Clearly, this is not only a win for one of Australia's most popular sports, but a major diplomatic coup for Canberra. It means Papua New Guinea will have its own National Rugby League team, which will continue to be financed for the next 10 years. But the big loser in all this is China, which has desperately sought greater economic and security influence in PNG in recent years, but may now have to take a back seat. While PNG insists the deal has nothing to do with China, the agreement will not be welcomed by Beijing, which has been fostering ties with Port Moresby for years. PNG has vast untapped mineral resources in which China is keen to have a stake, and there are at least 40 Chinese state enterprises already operating there. There's also PNG's strategic influence and importance in the Pacific, sitting just north of Australia and regarded as one of Melanesia's most influential countries. Of course, Australia has been part of PNG's history for many years and doesn't want to lose those close ties. Hence its enthusiasm to spend millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to further Papua New Guinea's most popular sport. The PNG government has celebrated the announcement as monumental and pivotal in anchoring the PNG-Australia relationship. That may well be the case, but Beijing is unlikely to share the same enthusiasm.
Well, Australia is also planning to force tech companies to pay for news shared on their platforms. It's a bid to put pressure on big tech firms such as Facebook, owner Meta, and Google to compensate publishers for content. The so-called News Bargaining Initiative will target social media platforms with Australian revenue of more than $160 million a year. It aims to create a financial incentive for these companies to pay Australian media firms for news content on their platforms. If they fail to do so, they could be slapped with more taxes. The charge is expected to begin at the start of next year, but it will be offset for any commercial agreements between the platforms and news media businesses. Back in 2021, Australia passed laws to make US tech giants compensate media firms for links that drive readers to their platforms. Meta says that while it agrees the current law is flawed, the new proposal fails to account for the realities of how their platforms work. But Australia says it is necessary to support local journalism as well as democracy.
The news bargaining incentive is critical to ensuring that digital platforms contribute to the sustainability of journalism in Australia. A strong and diverse news sector is vital for our democracy. And the rapid growth of digital platforms in recent years has disrupted Australia's media landscape, and it is threatening the viability of public interest journalism.
Syria's interim Prime Minister Mohammed al-Bashir has pledged to protect minority rights in the country as the nation focuses on a transition of power. This as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken makes his way to the Middle East to press for a, quote, inclusive transition in Syria following the ouster of President Bashar al-Assad. According to the U.S. State Department, Mr. Blinken is set to arrive in Jordan today, beginning a regional tour to promote U.S. support for a Syrian-led transition to a new government. The U.S. top diplomat will also be addressing concerns about Syria becoming a base for terrorism or posing threats to its neighbors. All eyes are now on Syria's new interim prime minister, who has urged millions of displaced Syrians to return home, adding that efforts are underway to restore Damascus International Airport for operations, a move seen as critical for rebuilding the war-torn nation. A Syrian rebel leader, Ahmad al-Shara, also known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani, has vowed justice for victims of Assad's regime. He called for the extradition of former regime officials who fled abroad, pledging to hold those responsible for torture and extrajudicial killings accountable. His rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, continues to consolidate power, claiming control of the oil-rich city of Deir el-Zor after pushing out the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. And in the northwest, public anger over the Assad family's decades-long rule has manifested symbolically, with protesters burning the tomb of ousted leader Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz, who ruled Syria with an iron grip for 30 years. The UK-based War Monitor Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, meanwhile, says that Israeli forces have conducted fresh airstrikes on former Assad regime military sites, while Turkish drones have targeted areas controlled by Kurdish forces. Well, one estimate says that it will take at least $250 billion to rebuild Syria. Michelle Strouk from the Center for Strategic and International Studies tells us where the country will get the funds to do so.
The support to rebuild is a very important question. I think it remains to be seen. Certainly, many countries around the world are leading aid donors and could potentially pitch in to be able to help reconstruct. But I think one fundamental principle that can't be left out is that Syrians have to be in charge of their own destiny. We saw this collapse of the Assad government happen despite having 13 years of various kinds of foreign governments that were involved in this. We saw Syrians taking this into their own hands and making this happen. So it's an extremely important principle and a principle of human rights to ensure that Syrians are in charge of and involved in the planning of any reconstruction. The funding that comes in, of course, should be therefore something that is allowing them to lead in the prioritization of how they want to rebuild their country. One danger, of course, is that just given the politics of what's happened in Syria over time, that it could again be left to divisions or be not supported in the ways that Syrians are demanding by countries like the United States, like my country. And so it's really important, again, to center their voices and to think about how to support them.
Coming up next on East Asia tonight, South Korea marks the anniversary of a military coup as it grapples with the fallout from a short-lived martial law decree. And China's annual Central Economic Work Conference is underway. Officials gathering to set the tone for the world's second biggest economy in the coming year. You're watching East Asia tonight. Beijing's top officials are gathering to discuss what they plan for the economy next year at the annual Central Economic Work Conference. Observers say that policymakers will be looking to tackle soft domestic demand and address what is expected to be a deepening trade war with the U.S. Investors, meanwhile, are keeping a close eye for signs of more measures to boost growth. And for more, CNA's Tan Yu-Guan joins us now live from Shanghai. So, Yu-Guan, what is the latest from the Central Economic Work Conference?
Well, I'm afraid we've all been waiting with bated breath for word from the Central Economic Work Conference, and so far there's not been any word from them. It typically gathers leaders from the central government and also the provincial governments, also the heads of state-owned institutions, financial institutions, as well as state-owned companies. The meeting is widely watched because, like you said, it gives investors a glimpse into how policymakers intend to approach the coming year. Now, ahead of this meeting, however, even though we have not heard from the CEWC yet, we did hear from the Communist Party's central decision-making body, and that is the Politburo. It did announce a moderately loose monetary policy and more proactive fiscal tools to support the economy. Now, this is language not heard since the global financial crisis more than a decade ago. That said, earlier I did speak to an associate professor for finance from NYU Shanghai, Ling Han Shen, and he says it's important to note that the Politburo has been rather controlled in its messaging ahead of the CEWC, the keyword being moderately. So he says that we should not be expecting dramatic lowering of interest rates, for example. He says the Chinese government is a student of history, and therefore it would have learned its lessons from the global financial crisis, which started in the US, as a result of a mountain of debt. And all it takes when there's a mountain of debt is a trigger to spark a crisis. So I asked him, what would he expect from the CEWC tonight? And this is what he has to say.
When I look at all the different types of measures that the government could help to support stimulus, there would be two things I'd pay a lot of attention to. First of all would be any particular measures to support consumption. So that would be very critical. But second, I would pay particular attention on what measures would be made to support small businesses, specifically for small businesses to be paid faster. One thing you see over the past year is that the PMI number for small businesses has almost considerably always been in contraction. And this is a concern because 80% of China's working urban force is all employed by small enterprises. And if they're not getting paid in time, then they start laying off people. If people get laid off, they lack consumer confidence. If they don't have that confidence, it's tougher for them to want to spend. And so that spending, that recovery and willingness to spend is really at the heart of China's private sector growth and overall economic recovery.
Now, it's worth noting while we wait for direction from the CEWC that there has been a Reuters report which says that, Chinese policymakers are considering allowing the yuan to weaken in 2025 to blunt the impact of U.S. tariffs expected when Donald Trump takes office in the White House. Now, letting the yuan depreciate would make Chinese exports cheaper and therefore blunt the impact of those tariffs. Now, Reuters based its report on 3 people it spoke to who have this knowledge of the discussion, but spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak to the public about this matter. That said, later, Financial News, a publication from China's central bank, did release a report saying that the foundation for a basically stable yuan remains solid, and that the yuan is likely to stabilize and even strengthen near the end of the year. Now, we do have to remember a devalued yuan would have an impact on imports and could actually possibly trigger inflation and then consumer confidence. Now, let me share that I do have an anecdote today when I was having lunch with a Shanghai resident, and she was basically glued to her phone about announcements from the CEWC because she's also looking to dump a stock that she has bought earlier. Now, this really goes to show how much this meeting means even to the folks on the streets. Oteli?
Hey, many thanks for that report and sharing that anecdote with us as well. CNA's Tan Yuguan, live from Shanghai. Now, amid the political uncertainty that's gripping South Korea, the country marks the 45th anniversary of the start of a military dictatorship following the assassination of President Park Chung-hee. Then, General Chun Doo-hwan staged a coup, imposed martial law, and ruled the country with an iron fist for 8 years. For some South Koreans, President Yoon's short-lived martial law decree reminded them of this dark period. And CNA's Lim Yun-suk has more.
This movie, titled December 12th, The Day, depicts the events surrounding the December 12th coup in 1979 in South Korea. It was released a year ago. But since last week, it topped Netflix movie ratings, attracting viewers who had watched similar scenes unfold on television when President Yoon Suk-yeol stunned the nation by imposing martial law on December 3rd. For many South Koreans, that night brought back memories of the military coup led by then General Chun Doo-hwan.
처음에는 좀 뜨끔했어요. 무슨 또 전두환 그 시절 같은 그런 거 또 이거 하나. 근데 뭐 조금 말을 조심하겠지만은 설마 또 그날에 또 일을 저지르는 거 아닌가.
우리 베이비 부모인데 그래도 전쟁도 안 겪고 우리 선대모냐 뭐 식민지 전쟁 뭐 이런 거 없지만 우리는 잘 먹고 잘 살았어요. 열심히 일한 거예요. 근데 이 토양을 가지고 이런 식으로 한마디 국민을 그 모욕감을 줍니다.
Following the coup, dictator Chun Doo-hwan declared martial law across the country on May 17, 1980, to deal with student protesters across the country. South Koreans took to the streets, especially pro-democracy activists in the southwestern city of Gwangju a day later. Military forces were sent in, and there were even orders to fire into the crowd. Gwangju residents banded together to fight. But after several days, tanks rolled and quashed the uprising for good. Hundreds of protesters died. Professor Joseph Yi at Hanyang University says he sees some parallels between how Chun Doo-hwan used martial law to suppress democracy movements and framed opponents as threats to national security, and President Yoon's actions on the 3rd of December. But he says the situation was completely different this time around.
Even though both presidents portray the opposition as enemies, the majority of the party did not support the President Yoon. So I think the clear difference is that we have a very different set of social norms in both the Conservative Party and the military that is strongly against exercising any form of violence against civilians. Unless the president was completely crazy, if he had any rational thought, then I think he would have known that this was not going to be a true coup d'etat.
After the coup and period of martial law, the 1987 Constitution introduced several key safeguards. Professor Yi says they include limiting the president to a single 5-year term to prevent a prolonged concentration of power seen during authoritarian regimes, and legislative oversight of executive actions, such as the power to impeach the president with a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly and overturn a martial law decree with a simple majority vote. Watching events unfolding in South Korea, Professor Yi warns that liberal democracies backslide when partisans view their opponents not as legitimate rivals, but as harmful enemies of democracy and the nation.
This is something that worries me because I see the same pattern. So I'm very wary about the politics of stigmatization and suppression. And I think we should all be careful about that because right now at this moment, it's so easy to use this, kind of moral panic to, stigmatize and suppress your opponents.
This is especially as South Korea has become a very polarized nation. For years, lawmakers have debated whether there's a need to amend the Constitution. A key proposal is allowing presidents to serve a second term, but to reduce the length of a single term to 4 years from 5 years, similar to the U.S. Supporters say this would allow more stability in policies. But this would mean a departure from the single-term system meant as a safeguard against dictatorship. It's unclear if it would still find support following Yoon's martial law attempt, which reminds South Koreans of their hard-fought democracy. Lim Yan-suk, CNA, Seoul.
And that does it for this Thursday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.